The Motor Dream podcast is recorded on Wallamedigal land of the Eora Nation. It always was and always will be the lands of the First Nations of Australia.
Few people really do know myself. Few people know me, and they just don't understand what it takes from a racing driver that has dedicated all his life, since I'm in this thing somehow, since 4 years old, to activity. Somebody that has left behind thousands of miles away family and friends to live in Europe and go through all the steps to eventually come to Formula One.
It only seems and feels like yesterday that Ayrton Senna tragically lost his life at the San Marino Grand Prix. But in reality, it has been 30 years.
Mansell closes, but it's too late, and Ayrton Senna wins at Monaco for the 5th time.
In the 10 years that he competed in Formula One, Senna won 41 Grand Prix and claimed 65 career pole positions as well as 19 fastest laps, culminating in 3 world titles in 1988, 1990 and 1991. He started out with the fledgling Toleman team before joining Lotus and then to McLaren, where he would achieve the bulk of his success.
Ayrton Senna crosses the line and you can see his exultation. He knows he is the world champion.
That is the greatest moment, with feelings of great pleasure for the rest of his life.
In 1994, he joined Williams Grand Prix Engineering, where he had hoped to claim his 4th world title with Damon Hill as his teammate. Sadly, it was not to be. The worldwide news coverage and the subsequent outpouring of grief was nothing like the world had seen before when it came to the passing of a sporting icon.
Brazilian President Itamar Franco has declared 3 days of mourning for Formula One racing champion Ayrton Senna, who died in a crash at the San Marino Grand Prix overnight.
In those 30 years, the sport of Formula One and motor racing as a whole has changed substantially, and yet the death of Ayrton Senna and its impact on those that respected him, either as fans, those who worked closely with him, or those who reported on his achievements in the media, still resonates strongly to this very day.
Racing, competing, is in my blood. It's part of me, it's part of my life. I've been doing it all my life. And it stands up before anything else.
On this special edition of the Motor Dream podcast, we pay tribute to one of the greatest drivers in Formula One on the 30th anniversary of his untimely passing on May the 1st, 1994.
This is the Motor Dream podcast.
Hello, I'm Conor McNally, and thank you for joining me on this special episode of the Motor Dream podcast as we pay tribute to Ayrton Senna. As I mentioned in the opening titles, it only seemed like yesterday that the tragic events of the San Marino Grand Prix happened. But to the millions of fans and colleagues that witnessed what happened, life and time itself has flown so fast in those 30 years. I was only a 13-year-old teenager on the cusp of turning 14 when Senna was tragically killed. And I can still remember watching the horror unfold right in front of my eyes as I sat glued to the live coverage that was beamed to households around Australia on the 9 network, who were then the host broadcaster for Formula One. Now, normally I would put a fresh videotape into my VCR, press record, and depending on how exciting the race was, I'd either stay up or I'd let it run and go to bed. But this was no ordinary Grand Prix. There had already been some horrifying moments during the weekend, starting off with Rubens Barrichello crashing violently at the Variante Bassa in his Jordan Hart, having launched off a curb at 225 kilometres an hour and into a retaining wall at 95 G. After almost choking to death by his tongue in the immediate aftermath, FIA doctor Professor Sid Watkins quickly acted to save his life before he was airlifted to hospital with nothing more than a broken nose and a sprained wrist. Then, on the Saturday of qualifying, Austria's Roland Ratzenberger lost control of his Simtek Ford at the Villeneuve Curva and crashed head-on into the retaining wall to his left, sustaining a basal skull fracture and blunt trauma. The front wing of his Simtek had failed, which was believed to have been damaged a lap prior as Ratzenberger was pushing hard to qualify for the race, Remember, there was more than 30 cars trying to qualify for 26 spots on the grid. The impact of the crash was so tremendous, which was registered at 500 G, that there was no way he would have survived the severity of the crash. Ratzenberger became the first driver since Elio De Angelis to have died behind the wheel of a Formula One car, and his death was the first at a Grand Prix since the 1982 Canadian Grand Prix, when Riccardo Paletti was killed in a start line crash. But no one had ever expected that Senna would be killed on that very same weekend in such tragic circumstances. There was a sense of numbness when I first woke up and heard the news that I had dreaded the very next morning. And for the next week, I was just trying to comprehend how life could just be so cruel and still move on, all whilst collecting every little news clipping and magazine article I could find. Time does and always will move forward, and it never stops for anyone or anything. And whilst many will fondly remember his achievements behind the wheel, as well as his humanitarian efforts in his native Brazil, the impact of his death still resonates to those who worked closely with him. Recently, I got to chat with two people who had the privilege to work closely with Senna over a long period. They were also at the Autodromo Enzo Edino Ferrari circuit on that very fateful weekend. When Senna joined Williams for the 1994 season after 6 years at McLaren, Anne Bradshaw was the team's press officer, and she had the responsibility of looking after all the interview requests and public relations for the team in what was an exciting time for everyone. For Bradshaw, it was the reunification of their working relationship, having previously looked after Senna when he drove for Lotus in 1985 via the public relations company she had worked for at the time. Not long after that, she would join Williams full-time, where she would remain for a full decade. Senna had joined Williams at a time when the team was riding high on its success. It had won the last two World Drivers' and Constructors' Championships and was aiming for a third successive crown in both titles. But there had been a significant change to the regulations in 1994. Traction control and active suspension had been outlawed, and the cars were more aggressive to drive than before. For Senna, it had been a horrid start to the season. Back-to-back retirements in Brazil and the Pacific Grand Prix in Japan meant that the Brazilian had to win to get his championship hopes back on track. But little did Bradshaw, the team, and the entire world realised that life as they knew it would be turned on its head by the end of the weekend. Anne Bradshaw, thank you for joining me to talk about the 30th anniversary of Ayrton Senna's passing. It's hard to believe it is 2024, the 30th anniversary of that tragic weekend in Imola. How much of that weekend left an indelible mark on your life?
Oh, an awful lot of it. I mean, you're obviously, when you've been in this as long as I have, you've seen a lot of weekends and a lot of ups and downs. But it can't get any worse than losing a driver in that sad way. And so, you remember things that perhaps you don't even remember from the good weekends. I most likely remember more from that weekend than from weekends when we won championships.
You were the press officer for Williams Grand Prix Engineering for a 10-year period between 1985 to 95. And unfortunately for you, the job fell on you to handle the overwhelming amount of media attention that came in the immediate aftermath of his accident on that day. What can you remember of what you did on that very day?
When you're at a track and you have your driver has an accident, first of all, you go into, well, what happened, find out what's going on. So, you go into a sort of an autopilot because you have to go and check with the FIA, check with the FIA press officer, go and talk to people, and assess what's going on, because, all you can do is see what's on the TV, but information coming through is quite sketchy. But it sort of became quite clear quite quickly that it was quite a serious accident. And it was just, going up to the FIA press officer, a good friend of mine who's now running the Saudi Grand Prix, Martin Whitaker, talking with him, going back to the team, obviously having to make sure that Damon was okay, because he's got a second driver, and the race was stopped, and nobody really knew what happened. So you had to to divide yourself between the various things, and then even, prepare for a restart, because Ayrton had been injured, he'd been taken away. You obviously, if he's taken away, flown to a hospital, it's serious, but you still have a race to run, and you had to think, well, yes, better get down there, make sure Damon's okay. Can't burden him. You have to hold it up for him. He was great. He's just, you sort of, without saying anything, he knew that it was serious, but he was prepared to get back in that car and race for the team, and which was his job. And so you had to make sure all that happened seamlessly, but while keeping an eye on what was going on. I mean, there was people at the hospital were, the doctors was sort of giving updates in Italian, so trying to work out what he was saying. And we had his brother there, his manager there, his PR lady there, so obviously look after them, but obviously they were more focused on what was going on at the hospital than they were what was focused going on at the in the racetrack.
How taken back were you by the outpouring of grief when the announcement was made that he had passed away?
Oh, I mean, he was iconic. I mean, he was the driver that everybody adored, and I still, I looked on, because it was his 64th birthday, and just people like sort of Lewis Hamilton, my hero, and it's still there. He's still the center of attention and a lot of people who most likely never even saw him drive live. Perhaps saw him on television but never saw him, but still. So yeah, he was special. He'd won his world championships. He had come to it Williams when we were, riding on a crest of a wave. Frank and him had always been great friends. So yeah, I wasn't, nobody was surprised at the outpouring, and particularly as in Brazil, he was an icon. He was somebody who shone a light for them, because Brazil in those days was not the richest country. Didn't have, had its footballers, had its Pelés and that, but to have somebody as internationally acclaimed as Ayrton, they were very proud of him. So to lose him, it was obviously a big wrench for the country as well as for motorsport.
You mentioned before that he joined the team at the beginning of the 1994 season, and there was much hype and excitement for Senna to come to Williams because it was a bit of a homecoming. He came to test for them in 1983, the year that he won the British Formula 3 Championship. I'm sure you remember that. What do you remember of that time leading up to the 94 season?
Well, I mean, obviously 93 had been when Prost had won, and so Williams was a place to be. Frank and Ayrton spoke a lot, not even about coming and driving for me, but they both loved airplanes. So he'd often chatted to him, and obviously he was he looked to see what had been going on with Nigel, and with Alan, and seen, that's where I want to get my next world championship. And yeah, there was a lot of hype. We did a big launch in Estoril. We got Rossmans on board, so we had Rossmans as the sponsors. We got Renault engines. It was all high profile. I mean, I remember when we did the launch, we were doing live links all around the world because everybody wanted to speak to Ayrton and Damon and Frank about what was going on. And yeah, expectations were high, but then we had some problems in testing. So though we were quick, it wasn't going quite as we'd expected to be. So we, as I say, we were quick. So we'd also, unfortunately not gone to the first races and won. We'd got pole, but we hadn't won. So, it's expectations high, but then suddenly, it's not quite happening how we expected it would. We've not continued where we left off.
We all know what an incredible talent he was behind the wheel. What was he like to deal with as a person, given the very short amount of time that you had with him when he drove for the team at the time?
Well, in fact, I had dealt with him before in '86. It was a long story, but I'd actually moved from Williams to Lotus in '86. It's to do with the agency I was working for, who looked after both teams, and the guy who was looking after JPS Lotus left. And it was a bigger account than the Williams account, so I was asked if I'd move on to it. So I actually had worked with him that year. There was him and Johnny Dumfries, so I knew him well. But I knew him first before he was a world champion, and so it's very different when you deal with somebody who's wanting to win a world championship, and then somebody who has won world championships. But no, he was always a spiritual person. It was a private person, spiritual, easy to get on with, but very, very focused, determined. And he was more relaxed because, as I say, when he came to Williams, he hadn't got anything to prove. He'd proved that he could win world championships. So that was where we stood.
I have to ask this question, and it's only just popped into my mind. There were rumours at the time when Nigel Mansell was on the out with Williams and he decided to go off and do IndyCar. There were rumours that Senna would drive for Williams for free. Is there any truth to that particular rumour?
I think, well, shall we just say, I think he did say it, but to wind up Prost.
Because there was that big rivalry at the time, and it was like if you look at Hamilton, Verstappen, and that rivalry there, I guess when you look at Alain and Ayrton, that rivalry was probably twice as what we've seen in current times.
Yes, I mean that was proper rivalry. There was no quarter given, and I mean, let's be honest and say, I don't think he would ever come for nothing, and we wouldn't expect him to. You'd expect to pay for a driver like him, and just a bit. But in those days, drivers used to say more things to wind people up. I mean, Ayrton, why not? I mean, not as bad as Nelson Piquet, who said the most awful things to wind other drivers up, but we won't go into that now. But yeah, it's why not just say, well, because at that time, well, that's the car everybody wanted. Like, today, if you said, somebody will say, well, I'll drive for, if Alonso came and said, I'll drive for Red Bull for free, you would consider it because, the guy is good. But I don't think Alonso would drive for free, but you wouldn't expect him to. But I think it was just a sort of an opening gambit to say, Alan Prost, well, if you don't want to be in there, I'll get in there.
Indeed. I was actually reminded recently from a colleague of mine at SBS of some really cool footage that was taken from qualifying of the weekend in Imola, where he did a live onboard chat to French television, and I'm sure you remember it. And he talked a lap around the Autodromo Enzo Dino Ferrari circuit, and there was that added touch where he said hello to Alain Prost live on air, which made it even more special. Tell us a little bit of how that came to be.
Well, obviously we'd got Renault as our engine manufacturer and supplier, and they're very French TV, TF1 as it was in those days, very important to them. And so they actually had done a deal whereby that they would do a lap with the set, with the comms with Ayrton for TF1. It was a straightforward deal to help Renault, to make Renault happy. And obviously, drivers in their contracts, they have certain things that they do for sponsors. And that was just one of those things. They came up and said, well, we'd like you to do it. And Ayrton said, yeah, I'll do it. And and it was Alan Prost came on and hello. And then, Ayrton did say, I miss you. And they actually, it was like a sort of a coming together of two great champions who had been two great rivals, but a lot of respect. And and I'm sure for somebody like Ayrton to have Alan Prost driving against him, whatever happened in places like Suzuka, it's much more fun than going, not having somebody to race against, because that's what you do. You're competitive, and if you're competitive, you want to beat other people. You don't want to just drive away and leave them in your wake. You want to prove that you're best by beating them on track.
You mentioned before that Ayrton was a very spiritual person, and many people thought that he had possessed a higher spirit on the day of what happened. He was obviously impacted by what happened with Roland Ratzenberger the day before, and it was reported at the time that Professor Sid Watkins spoke to him after he witnessed the accident side and said, maybe you should go and retire and come and do a day of fishing with me. It's easy to look at this retrospectively, but you were quite close to him, as you've mentioned. How difficult was it for him to compose himself in light of some such tragic circumstances?
Well, that weekend it had started badly with Rubens Barrichello's accident, and obviously they were great mates. And he'd rushed out. I mean, Rubens, was incredibly lucky. I mean, ended up sort of hanging from the catch fencing with his car, and so that had started badly. And obviously, no driver wants to see a fellow driver injured, because that's not, I suppose, however self-centered they are, it also makes you think of your own mortality. So you had that. Then Roland's accident, and obviously that affected everybody badly. And that was it. Nobody wanted to get back out because they didn't want to disrespect Roland's, by just saying, oh, okay, we're just going to go back out and carry on qualifying. But, again, Ayrton was a racing driver. I don't, a lot has been made about him and Prof, who are very good friends. But I don't know. Ayrton still, he still was a racing driver, competitive, and I mean, as somebody did once say, God looked away from F1 that weekend. He turned his back on us, which, when you look at what happened at the beginning of the race with Leto, and we had a pit lane fire and those things. I mean, it was everything that you could happened. But he was thoughtful, and you couldn't see all that sort of thing and not be affected. But he was still getting in his car and going racing, and that's what he did. That's what he did for a living. That's what he loved doing. So I didn't get the feeling that he was ready to go fishing.
I don't see him being the fishing kind of person. I think he would just love to be flying in his planes or something like that.
I mean, I could have seen him eventually being a politician in Brazil, because he loved absolutely adored his team, and he that he had round him, and Brazil, and so it was the pride of his own country, and I'm sure he would have ended up most of it being a president of the country or something like that. But I can't, I don't know. I might be wrong, but I didn't see him ready to throw in the towel and take a fishing rod. But who knows what goes inside people's heads when you've seen that sort of thing. I mean, the people saying, he'd got an Austrian flag in the car for Ratzenberger and things like that. But I mean, you've got to be an Iceman not to be affected by what happened that weekend. And I'm sure every driver was affected. I mean, Damon, everybody driver was affected. But because of what they did, they dealt with this in different ways, but they did deal with it.
From your perspective, what made him stand out as a driver compared to his contemporaries at the time?
He was just better. What makes Max Verstappen stand out? What made Lewis Hamilton? They were better, and I don't know what makes you a better driver, whether it's your fighting spirit, whether it's your spatial awareness, your coordination in the car, but there is something like you see a golfer, a tennis player, a cricketer, a footballer. They just have a gift that not everybody has, and if you get a gift like that, you use it. That's it. But there's no way I could even begin to work out why he was better than anybody else, but he was.
I don't think anyone can really explain why he was so quick at Monaco in '88 when he was faster than anyone else by 1.5 seconds. I mean, that is just a lap that people still talk about to this very day.
It's like people. One thing in the sport these days that I'm not too keen on is this blue flag. You've got to watch out for the blue flag because somebody's faster coming. Ayrton didn't need a blue flag to get pole position in Monaco. He used his driving experience. And in those days, you weren't down to 10 drives. You had 20 odd cars on the track. But that was it. he knew how to drive a car. He knew how to master the track, and yeah, he had a God-given gift, which he used to his full.
If he was still alive today, what do you think he would make of the current regulations and the sport as a whole? Do you think he would be embracing of it, or do you think he would give his own opinions of what he thought could be better for the sport or what didn't work?
I don't know. I still think he would have been leading Brazil. I think he would have been a politician in Brazil, or I think he'd have been human rights or something. I just believe that I think he'd have kept an eye on the sport, but some of the drivers you think, oh well, when they retire, yeah, they'll come back, and you see them listed, the paddock listed with ex-drivers being commentators and this sort of thing. I can't quite see him being a pundit or a commentator or standing there and spouting off about what's right and what's wrong with the sport. I think he just embraced the sport for what he was doing then, and I think he'd say, well, if that's the future, then get on with it, which I believe in as well. I think we look back too much and say, oh, we shouldn't do it, but just look forward, and I think he would have always looked forward.
Yeah. What about the halo? Do you think if it was implemented way back then, do you think that may have saved him, or do you think it was too far ahead of its time back then to even consider it?
Well, you see, it was a small piece that came off the suspension that went through his helmet. I mean, I would love to think that. I mean, I think the halo has saved lives. I mean, I've got no doubt that has saved lives of many top drivers. I mean, you look at when Max and Lewis in Monza. I mean, that would have been a different outcome without a halo. And I think,
oh, no question.
Yeah, and you look at Grosjean and things like that. But yeah, I don't know, as I say, because it was just a small piece of that came through the helmet. It who knows? It might have hit the halo. It might not. As I say, I'm not going to necessarily say it would have saved him, but yeah, I mean, you'd like to have had everything in that car to save the drivers, but I mean, F1 is very different safety wise since then. I mean, a lot of people say, oh, there was lots of knee-jerk reactions. Well, you need it when you kill 2 racing drivers in one weekend. For goodness sake, yeah, look at yourself, look inward and work out how we can make these cars safer. They're never going to be the safest things on 4 wheels. That's let's be honest. Most fans wouldn't go and watch it if they were like on rails and never went off, never crashed. It's awful to say it, but most people would like to see the odd crash, but they want to see the drivers get out. But I think anything you can do to make it safe, and I think the halo was amazing, and I think it's a lifesaver.
No, I agree with that. Although going back to '94, we almost lost a third driver in Carl Vanlinger that the very race later in Monaco, and I mean that caused a huge uproar, particularly in the French press. And
suppose they were. I mean, their heads were sticking out. I mean, further you keep going back, and you see more and more of the driver. I mean, some points you see their elbows even. But that's a great thing. The sides got higher, the drivers got lower. So yeah, no, Carl's, I mean, very lucky guy to not have serious brain injury from that.
I agree.
But yeah, no, I mean, F1, obviously changed radically in its what it did for for safety and which is great. And I say it's a lot of very clever people worked on making it safer. And you have to, over the years, you look at people who have worked on safety. I mean, Jackie Stewart years ago, I mean, he was very unpopular, but he saved lives. And since then, a lot of people have saved lives, and let's be honest, say the halo was not that popular with quite a few drivers who were saying, "Oh no, we don't need that." Well, and quite a few drivers who have been saved by it.
Finally, on this podcast, I usually tell my guests that they receive an infinite budget from a mystery benefactor, and they can choose up to 3 cars, bikes and machines from their dream garage. So it sounds absurd, and it's obviously done in a light-hearted way, just for a bit of fun, because we all dream about what our dream garage would be. But given that this is a special episode focusing on Ayrton and his legacy, if there was one car from his much celebrated career you would love to own, what would it be?
I think the Tolman.
Wow.
that he got his first podium in. I think that car would be special. Because that you remember, he nearly won in Monaco.
I remember that.
I was there, and it wet and raining, and that made everybody stand up and think, oh gosh. And we all still say that they put the flag out early so that he didn't beat Alan Prost. I mean, but you're dealing with the French, sort of Monegasque. So say it was a bit sort of patriotic there. But yeah, that would be the car I would love, because I think that was what started everybody saying, look at that youngster. And in those days, a Tolman could, or like in the early days with the Williams, they could be giant killers. They could get in there. I mean, I don't think we're ever going to see some of the ones at the back of the field doing that today. Just isn't going to happen. But in those days, it did, and I think that would be my car.
I think that would have been a very popular victory if Ayrton actually went on to win the Grand Prix. That would have just made Tolman, I think.
Yeah.
But then again, he won the Portuguese Grand Prix in 1985 in the Lotus, and that was a stellar drive as well.
Yeah, I remember that. That was actually my first race on track working for Williams.
Wow.
That Grand Prix. So that was my very first one where I was actually working for the team. So I remember it well. Oh gosh, it did rain. I got wet and dry. And of course, in those days, you didn't have a nice warm media centre you could sit in and watch everything on TV. If you wanted to know what was going on, you had to go and stand out on the track. And I did. I was with a couple of my really lovely friends, journalists, Nigel Roebuck and Alan Henby, and I remember standing with them and watching it. Yeah.
Was that the time that that those two particular races you thought this is someone that's going to go all the way to win a world championship?
I mean, I think by Portugal we knew that guy was something special. I mean, everybody used to, because he kept getting pole positions but not winning races. And I remember somebody saying, you don't win championships by getting pole positions. And we said, yeah, you wait, the guy will do. But yeah, I mean, I think it was quite obvious back to F3 that he was special, because I had quite a lot of friends who followed him then, photography wise or journalism wise, and they said, it was a bit special then. And you look at people say, following kids, and you look at these kids, the Ollie Behrmans at this day and age, people saying, we knew in karts that they were going to be good, so and Lewis's, but I mean, nowadays we see them even earlier because they're out karting and winning. But I think he was always going to be good. He was always got a special talent.
Having covered many sports since starting his television broadcast career for ITV under Anglia Television in 1977, Steve Ryder is known by many in his native England as the face of the BBC's Grand Prix coverage, as well as hosting for ITV. Beyond that, he's known by many worldwide as the anchor of the British Touring Car Championship during the Super Touring era of the 1990s, and he continues this role to this day. But in his early years covering motorsport for Anglia, Ryder first witnessed the emerging talents of a young Brazilian from the metropolis of Sao Paulo who moved to England to make a name for himself in Formula Ford and Formula 3.
I am just 22-year-old, and there is plenty of time to get Formula 1 if I will get there.
Senna would win both classes in convincing fashion, and it was Ryder who was there to witness and report the talents of the young Brazilian, who would be snapped up by Tolman after testing for Williams, Brabham and McLaren. When Ryder joined the BBC in 1985 and became the host of its iconic Grandstand programme, he also became a part of its Grand Prix coverage, as anchorman for its live and highlights programmes either in the studio or on location, and he was fortunate enough to witness Senna's success at the height of his career. Ryder was seconded to host the live coverage of the San Marino Grand Prix, but was only required for the Sunday component due to prior broadcast commitments. He arrived on Sunday morning with the added pressure of the tragic events of Ratzenberger's passing the day before, and was ready to bring the race to the millions watching back home on the BBC and around the world. But little did Ryder realise that he would be the bearer of bad news that afternoon of the race. In the immediate aftermath of Senna's crash, Ryder would report live that his condition was declared grave by doctors at Bologna Hospital, before delivering the inevitable later that night.
Good evening. If you've tuned in tonight expecting the outstanding race that the San Marino Grand Prix here at Imola promised to be, then I'm sorry, that's not the programme we have for you. Instead, the sport of Formula One tonight is in deep mourning. After a high-speed crash at Tamburello, Ayrton Senna is dead.
Steve Ryder, thank you for joining me on this special episode of the Motor Dream.
Yeah, pleasure.
It's hard to believe it's been 30 years. You were there, like Anne Bradshaw was, on that fateful day in 1994, and you had, I guess, probably one of the toughest tasks that you've ever had to do, I guess, in your career, announcing live on television the passing of Ayrton Senna. That must have been probably one of the most surreal moments of your career, I reckon.
It was, and the whole weekend was pretty surreal. You know, people have gone over, you know, not just, you know, the dreadful events of the Sunday, but also of the Saturday, and, you know, a weekend that started with Barrichello's big crash as well. But for me, it was, I mean, it felt an odd one right from the start, because BBC being the BBC, haven't got much money. So I was stretched over the weekend. On the Saturday, I was at Wembley presenting the Rugby League Challenge Cup final. And then I would fly out to Italy on the Saturday night and get off to the race. I got a call from Simtech Racing late on Friday saying, are you going to Imola on Saturday night? We need a suspension part or something like that hand carried through. And they delivered this thing to the studio at Wembley Stadium. And goodness knows, you know, how they got it through security, but it's about this big brown paper thing. And it was leaning against the back of the studio wall while we were doing the Rugby League Challenge Cup final, during the course of which, around about 2:00, we had to give the news of Roland Ratzenberger's death at Imola. And you look across, and Simtech driver, and there's a Simtech suspension part leaning against the back of the wall, and you know, immediately you think, you know, this is strange. And anyway, got to the circuit. Everything was low key, as you can imagine, and everyone was very reflective. But you know, up for a race which was of greater significance than any Formula One race for quite some time, because Ayrton had made this bad start to the season. Schumacher was the coming man, and even Autosport on, you know, that week said, you know, the heat is on Ayrton. You know, all the pressure was on Ayrton Senna. And we put the program on the air. I was at the front of the grid with Jonathan Palmer, and a couple of drivers came up, Martin Brundle, and we just chatted through. And the top of the program, Ayrton was sitting in his car and didn't get out, so and it was never on the radar to go to Ayrton and ask for a pre-race interview or anything like that. But and then the race started. There was a big start line incident with Pedro Lamy, and things were just going wrong. And then on the restart, we saw what happened with Ayrton, and immediately you knew. And from that point on, as a presenter, Grandstand in the UK is a multi-sports program. So you're standing on the pit wall, and it's not as if you haven't got anywhere else to go, because you can hand to the next frame of the World Snooker in Sheffield, which is what's going on at the moment. So we were trying to strike a balance between what we were, the growing understanding that this was a very serious situation for Ayrton, and also trying to also honor the protocol of Formula One, that, you know, until everything is absolutely confirmed, you don't make any announcement and any speculation about the outcome of an incident like that. So we spent, you know, the next hour or so trying to reassure. The difficulty was that we had one camera there, which was my camera. But it was a lifesaver, because if we hadn't had that, we would have been locked onto the Italian coverage, which was a helicopter looking straight down into the cockpit of the car, and you didn't want to be anywhere near coverage like that.
No.
So we were able to opt out of that. But all the time, you were looking at the faces in the pit lane. Annie Bradshaw, you mentioned, wore an expression that, didn't need any explanation. Martin Whitaker of the RS. We all knew. And then the race happened, and we didn't give the news on grandstand. I don't recall that we gave the news on grandstand, but we went straight to a news bulletin, which is the way of the BBC, and they gave it as the headline item in the national news bulletin, and then we contributed to that. Grand Prix was the program that was meant to reflect the race, and that was due out later in the evening. They pulled that from the schedules. We came straight back off the news bulletin and did an update with all the sad news and everything. But by the end of the day, we came away from the circuit about 10 o'clock at night, and there was myself and Murray Walker, and we were staying about 30 miles away. And we just sat in the car for an hour. I don't think anybody said a word all the way back. And then we got to where we were staying. There was a little bar next door, and Jonathan Palmer was with us, and there was a racing machine, a slot machine where and we had a couple of bottles of red wine and just gave it some stick on the racing machine. And everyone knew. I mean, for people like Jonathan, it was a perfect kind of. Everyone had to let off steam somehow. But wow, what an extraordinary day! And the guy that. I've been privileged enough to get to know reasonably well in the years coming up to 94, but it's a day you'll never forget, a weekend you'll never forget.
Does it still feel surreal to this very day that all that happened 30 years ago?
Yeah, because it wasn't meant to happen. You felt that on the Saturday, people didn't die in Formula One cars. And there was Roland Ratzenberger on the Saturday, followed immediately by Ayrton. And that alone was surreal. And then there were other incidents in the weeks that followed that really gave you the feeling that Formula One is going to fundamentally change. And thankfully it did. You can argue about whether it changed for the best or not. But we did a documentary at the end of the year. We were going to do a review of the year as we normally do, but we decided to do a documentary about Ayrton and everything that happened that weekend and everything that he delivered in his career. So we went back to Imola around about November to shoot stand-ups and little bits and pieces. And I remember we walked out to Tamburello, and it was a misty morning, and there's a rain in the air and weird and sort of gloomy day. And we stood there at Tamburello, and we were going to do a little bit of filming, just scene set stuff. And then you looked in the trees, and I said, there's people in there. And there must have been probably about 50 people just standing quietly in the trees behind the banners and everything that was, sprayed on the walls and all the tributes and so on. And you just thought, wow, this, it really underlines what a remarkable and tragic event this was, and the scale of the loss that the sport had. But this was 6 months after the event, and there were people just still there, standing quietly and laying a few flowers, and that was it.
And it still happens to this very day.
It still goes on, I'm sure.
Yeah,
I'm sure it does. I'm sure it does.
Well, I went to Imola last year on my honeymoon with my wife, and we went to Imola.
Oh, you're all romantic.
Yeah, I know. I know it sounds weird in a solemn situation, but when you think about it, it was, for me, I always wanted to go and pay my respects. So, and my wife is of Italian heritage, so we decided to go and visit Bologna, visit obviously Florence, go to Rome. We did all that. But I said to my wife, I really want to go and see the Senna Memorial in Imola, and so we went to the Autodromo Enzo Andino Ferrari, and you're right. The shrine that has been set up since which is on the inside of the circuit, and the memorial. It's just so captivating, so surreal, and yet at the same time, you leave with quite a profound effect that Senna had left on not just the sporting landscape, but motorsport as a whole. It just leaves you, I guess, shaken to the core that his success and his passing, his untimely passing, was just, it's still so surreal after all these years.
I think the thing about the relationship that the sport had and the spectators and the enthusiasts had with Senna was one in which you just couldn't be neutral. You couldn't be indifferent.
Yeah.
You either loved him and were captivated by him, or he frightened you to death because of his attitude and sometimes his approach to the sport, which was very unconventional and very Latin. But that's what made him different, and that's what provided all the sharp edges of the controversy and the rivalry with Alain Prost. He was such I say a divisive character. I don't mean that in the wrong kind of way, but you either loved him or you hated him. You couldn't be neutral about Ayrton Senna, which was what made him so special.
But it's not just a rivalry about Alain. It's also the rivalry that he had with Nigel Mansell, the rivalry that he had also with Martin Brundle, and you got to witness that back in the early to mid 80s in Formula 3.
To a certain extent, yeah. I mean, I was lucky enough to not to get to know him. That will be exaggerating, but I was working for a regional television company back in the late 80s. Where are we? Early 80s, I don't know. But it's Anglia Television in the east of England when Ayrton came over and joined Ralph Furman at Van Diemen and was racing Formula Fords and sleeping on the floor of Ralph Furman's house and so on. And we got to know him. We would go down there on occasions with a film camera and do club events, which Ayrton was involved in. And, Ralph Furman was saying, this guy's a bit special. And so we did a couple of film things with him when he was, just sort of settling in. And the great thing was, I wasn't particularly around that Formula 3 season, which was one of my great regrets that, we didn't really get stuck into that Senna-Brundle rivalry. And that was an extraordinary season. But from that early point, he never really forgot you. So if you were in a horde of film crews or journalists or something and you caught his eye, he would remember and recognize you and come over. So we always had that nice relationship, and I was lucky enough to sit down and do quite a few long interviews with him. And then other events, I hosted the reveal when he was at Lotus, and we did a couple of car launches together. And then the Autosport Awards, which I hosted for a number of years. I mean, he came on the stage there, and wow, he was, I just asked him the obvious questions, and he gave the right kind of answers. And then Murray was up on the stage with me as well, and Ayrton just took the mic and just talked for 15 minutes to 1,500 people at the Grosvenor. Explained his relationship with British motorsport and what he owed to British. I mean, you could not have scripted a more moving tribute, and everyone I think who saw that left the auditorium with a much greater understanding of what Ayrton was all about, and a much greater sympathy and enthusiasm for what he brought to the sport as well. He was, an extraordinary communicator, and part of that was the Latin temperament. I always got the same feeling when you were around Seve Ballesteros. The sort of smoke was coming out, and the charisma was you could almost touch it. But it was he was amazing, and we had some interesting times.
I'm sure you did. Which of the rivalries in that era of Formula One, and even probably beforehand, which of those rivalries do you look back on with great fondness after all these years?
Well, it has to be Senna-Prost, because, that was right in the core of the BBC's involvement in Formula One. It was a rivalry. If you contrast it with what's going on in Formula One at the moment, you would pay millions for a rivalry like that to be implanted into the modern Formula One scene. But it was, it put Formula One on the front pages. Ayrton had his critics, Prost had his critics. I was lucky enough to sit down with Alain Prost for one of the Legend series on Sky a few years ago. And he was fascinating because he was, he wasn't going to sit there and defend Ayrton. I mean, he was ultra critical of his approach to the sport, and he was very, very revealing about some of the elements of the rivalry that they had. But you could tell with Alain that deep down, he just thought this guy was, something extraordinary and something to be admired. And, even his unconventional approach to the sport was to be admired. That was that's the chemistry which makes up a fantastic rivalry. Two guys, similar talent, but a completely different approach and clashing. And he talked very interestingly about the Senna documentary, Alain Prost, and was very critical of the fact that it was portrayed as a bitter rivalry, and in Alain's mind, it was never ever that. And he was portrayed as the villain who was taking on this, great sort of romantic South American hero, and it was never that either. But what part of the mystique of Imola is that people say that the Sunday morning they got together and had a hug and had a chat and talked about what had happened the day before, and do you really want to carry on with a sport like this? And there was a real sort of reconciliation. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. He said it in the interview that it was, but it wasn't the kind of conversation that everyone assumed was a kind of bury the hatchet kind of conversation. It was a conversation, as he described it, just between two mates, two rivals, who would always have 100% respect for each other, every element, racing and life, and then so on. So, yeah, Prost Senna was fascinating, but that seems a few years ago as well now with what Mr. Verstappen's done to the sport.
Oh, most definitely. If Senna had survived, like if he had that crash, but it didn't affect him the way it had killed him, do you think we would have seen Senna bounce back from the horror start from 1994 and go on to win, or potentially win a few more world titles? Because I'm sure there's a lot of what ifs, obviously, but that's probably one of the big what ifs, I should say.
I'm completely the wrong person. I do not understand the technology of the sport or even remotely understand the politics of the sport. I would say that probably the momentum of his career was starting to run out at that point. I think that he was in for a very frustrating season against Benetton. And I think the things that were happening, or in his mind were happening behind the scenes at Benetton, would have got into his head and really sort of destabilized him, because there were so many accusations and politics and so on and so forth. He would have had to find himself the right car, to reach the heights that he produced in the late 80s and so on. But I think he would probably have, more importantly, gone on to develop, whether it's politics or whether it's some kind of social role. He would have been such a figurehead in South America, and such a uniting figurehead. I could well see him in politics. I could well see him in some kind of international role, because he was, as I say, he was the most fantastic communicator and the most fantastic uniting force for people. You saw that in the pictures of his funeral, which was just extraordinary. But I think he had the qualities to go on to be something above and beyond a racing driver. and I think that's where he would have ended up. Might even have aspired to be a commentator.
You never know. You never know. Although, mind you, he did do that onboard lap at that very weekend, and he said hello to Alain for French television. I mean, that was he
did,
and that was really special. I mean, I got reminded of it recently by a colleague of mine at SBS, and he's from France originally, and he told me about it. And I thought, oh yeah, I remember about that. And people still talk about that particular moment. It's like a special moment, like you mentioned before, like the respect between Ayrton himself and Alain. It was very much there, even though they were not competing against each other anymore.
Yeah, but it all adds to the mystique. He had this knack of just putting something out there, and people going, what does that mean? What is the point he's trying to make? And they start reading things into these things. The whole strong religious convictions and the fact that he gets visions in the car and all that sort of thing, probably completely misconstrued, but it was all part of the mystery of the guy. But the one thing I liked about him, and whether or not it's a Latin thing, I don't know, but he must have done 10,000 interviews in his life, and every time you walked up to Ayrton and asked him a question, it was the meaning of life to him. And we did a pre-season shoot. McLaren were quite optimistic about their prospects for the season, 89, 90, whatever it was. And they said, come out to Estoril and, come out to the pre-season test. And, we could, beat the drum for the season and, talk to Ayrton. So we went out to Estoril and, there's Ayrton bombing around. And we set up a camera, and he got out of the car and he went into the motorhome for a debrief for an hour, for 2 hours, 2.5 hours. We then had to move, because the light was fading. We then had to move up into the cafe area, and the camera guy was checking his watch because he had a flight to catch. And we thought, we can't come all this way and not talk to the guy. And then suddenly the door opened. And Joe Ramirez, the McLaren team boss, walked in with that and said, I'm very sorry. He said, time was against us, but here's Ayrton. And Ayrton, hi guys. And we had about 10 minutes to do this. So, I mean, how it is. You put a microphone on and you ask the first question almost as a sound test, because, you can't hang around too much. And I said, Ayrton, first time in the car ahead of the new season, what's the verdict? He said, I last sit in the car in third week in October. He said, in that time, my team and all the staff back at base, they have worked all hours, day and night. They work through Christmas, they work through New Year. No one has a day off. They have put so much effort, so many ideas into this new car. He said, and I have to say they have made no progress at all. Joe Ramirez in the but you asked me what the car's like. The car's shit.
It's like the Niki Lauda approach. It's like it drives like a pig.
Yeah. But you compare that, with modern Formula One. But you're surrounded by PR people and all that sort of thing. But that's what I liked about him. He said, you ask me that question, I will give you the answer. Nothing sugar-coated or anything like that.
And he gave you the answer straight, didn't he?
Oh, God. Yeah, wonderful.
The best race that you saw of Ayrton, what was the one race that you look back on in all your time that you've covered Formula One and you thought, that's the complete race by him?
Well, I mean, it would have to be Donington. What was it, 92, 93?
93.
And I would love to say that was the best race of it that I'd ever seen. I wasn't there, and it broke my heart. And as I said earlier, grandstand and the BBC, you get involved in a whole range of sports, and that had been shoehorned into the schedule as a European Grand Prix at Donington, and it was the same weekend as the Masters or Augusta.
Oh.
So I'm sitting out there at the Augusta National, at about 9 o'clock in the morning, watching the coverage come in from the UK. And I thought, well, so I missed one Grand Prix, what does that matter? And then you suddenly missed, the greatest first lap in motor racing history that anyone has. And we had a colleague from the football world, Bob Wilson, who was a good presenter, good friend, but this was the first motor race he'd ever seen in his life. You think? And he said, well, that was okay. He did quite well on the first lap, didn't he? And he said, oh no, how could you miss something like that? But that's the stand-up lap for them. Of course, wonderful memories of Silverstone with, riding on the back of the car and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I remember that with Nigel Mansell, 1991. You would have been there that day, and knowing
that day,
and that parochial British crowd obviously were cheering for Nigel. But yes, it was just an iconic situation to see Senna being driven back to the pits, hanging on for dear life aboard Nigel's Williams.
I think the symbolism of that wasn't lost on anyone.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Wow. If he was still alive, what do you think he would make of Formula One right now? Obviously, he might be doing something political or something on a world scale outside of the sport. But if he was still involved in some capacity, what do you think he would make of the current generation of the sport? Not just the drivers, but the cars as well.
I'm not sure he'd fit in that well, to be honest, because he is or was, a strong character, not essentially a team player, and I don't mean that disrespectfully, but you couldn't really imagine him sort of responding to a corporate environment. I think what I would love to see him could have become president of the FIA. I think he would bring some spectacular ideas to that job. Whether or not he would destroy the sport, I don't know. But he was such a revolutionary thinker. There was a kind of unstable element to some of his thinking, which made it even more exciting in a way. So, and I think he would have been a born leader. I could see him as maybe as a team boss, but definitely I could see him in a political role as president of the FIA. Yeah, that would have been something, especially after everything that happened in the late 80s with Balestra and everything.
That was a very volatile relationship between those two, Ayrton and Jean-Marie. And Jean-Marie, he was unashamedly French. He wore his heart on his sleeve. He wore his pride on his sleeve, and that led to some real battles on and off the track.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, I mean that was another element of a crazy time, and my goodness, Formula One needs that. I mean, it needs that to a healthy degree, and I think in the late 80s, maybe we're looking back on it with the rose-colored glasses, but it's the highs and lows of Prost versus Senna and Senna versus Balestra and Senna versus Mansell and so on. It was wrong to say a golden era, because not everything about it was perfect, but it was a compelling era for sure, and an era that really did Formula One no harm at all in hindsight.
One final question to finish up. And it's a question that I asked Dan at the end of my interview. I do this to all my guests. I tell them that they have received an infinite budget from this mystery benefactor, and it tells them that they can choose up to 3 cars, bikes, and machines for their dream garage. But given this is about Ayrton, his career, and the impact that he made on the sport, if there was one car from his much celebrated career you would love to own, across all the categories that he raced in his career, what would it be?
I mean, it would have to be the McLaren MP4 because that's what he was identified with. I think he is I'm not batting a question back, but I think he's one driver that's not defined by a car. He's not sort of Il Leone for Ferrari. He is Ayrton Senna, whether he's in a Tolman, a Lotus, a McLaren, a Williams, or whatever. But it would have to be the McLaren for sure. Outside of that, I don't know what kind of car really sort of identified Ayrton. I know that when we were doing, the series on, all the world champions, and we were lucky, and we were going around the world to Mario Andretti and out to Alan Jones in your part of the world. Everyone had a car collection. So that was a regret. I never got to see Ayrton at home and, the kind of things that he collected. But, I'm sure there was some exotic machinery and some eccentric machinery in there as well. But, to my mind, the McLaren doesn't define Ayrton, but Ayrton certainly defines that McLaren era.
In the 30 years since both Senna and Ratzenberger have passed, the sport has changed significantly. Whilst the cars themselves are faster than before, they are much safer and stronger. Track safety has also changed substantially, and although the risks of death remain, there are very few deaths now compared to back then. And whilst the likes of Michael Schumacher, Lewis Hamilton, Fernando Alonso and Max Verstappen have since surpassed Senna in their achievements, and those that follow will likely surpass them, we must never ever forget the legacy that Ayrton Senna left behind. A legacy that many still regard as one of the greatest in the history of Formula One. My thanks to Anne Bradshaw and Steve Ryder for their time and generosity in agreeing to come onto the podcast. A massive thank you as well to Louise Goodman for her help in putting me in touch with these wonderful people. This episode was written, edited, hosted and produced by me, Conor McNally. Audio grabs are credited to the BBC, Formula One Management and SBS Australia. Podcast episode artwork by Patrick Skinner. Make sure to follow the show on all the socials with the handle The Motor Dream, which is also the hashtag. And head to the show's website at themotordream.com.au where you can listen to episodes and find show notes and information on the show and the guests that appear. And please like and subscribe to the show as well as leaving a review on wherever you listen to your podcasts. I hope you enjoyed this special episode of the Motor Dream podcast. We'll be back with a regular episode in a few weeks' time.
Thanks for listening to the Motor Dream podcast. This series is proudly produced by Beast Productions.